Okay. Good morning, everyone. Very pleased to see an excellent crowd for a Saturday morning, bright and early. This session is the U.S. administration and the Middle East. The central purpose is what is the policy of the U.S. Toward the Middle East within the Trump administration, which is approaching its first year. We have a series of questions that we will address, and we have an excellent panel to address these questions. We do not have the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, who was unable to make it at the last minute. So we are in, I think, very capable hands in terms of the panel, and as has been the case, think tanks and the media have filled in and addressed the issues in terms of the administration's position on various issues and regions of the world, and we have a very able panel to help us explore this issue. I have been concerned about the Trump policies for some time in terms of, and predicted 12 to 14 months before the election, Trump's victory. And that was based on two factors which I think are global. One is what I describe as a sea of insecurity and changes in terms of technology that enabled Trump to surprise. I mean, often there is this notion of an October surprise. It was a November surprise. I voted on November 8th, got on a plane to Shanghai, China, in which there was a major meeting of all of the think tanks in China. And I would point out, surprisingly in an unscientific fashion, that trips to Russia and to China, and often I would poll, because it was during the election cycle, who of the candidates, who were you favoring, Clinton or Obama? And in both Russia and China, with leaders in terms of major think tanks and others, leaders in the country, there was an inclination, a fairly strong inclination, however unscientific, a preference for Trump, which I would explore with each group as to why that was the case, and had some interesting results. The other question I received as I left, voted, and got on a plane on November 8th, arrived early the next morning in Shanghai on November 9th. There was no information, obviously, during the flight. All of the cell phones went off, and there was surprise among those on the plane in terms of the election results. I was not surprised. There are, I think, characteristics in terms of the discussion we're going to have of Trump that define his administration, although I think there's significant continuity in policy between the Obama and Trump administrations. So without further ado, I'd like to have our panel. We'll have one round of presentations by each of the panelists. We will then have a second round and conclude the session. The first panelist is Ian Lesser, who is Vice President for Foreign Policy and Executive Director of the Transatlantic Center for the German Marshall Fund. Ian?
Jim, thank you very much. Good morning. You know, in Brussels, when we hold events there, if you put Trump in the title of the event, you fill the room. And I fear that there's something of that effect here, even on a Saturday morning. And for good reason, because I think when you look at American foreign policy in general, but in particular when you look at the Middle East, there's tremendous sort of uncertainty about where the United States is going, what U.S. strategy is, whether we're going to be more engaged or less engaged, and so on. So let me maybe just make 3 points to you. The first, I think, is that, in my view, there is something of a mythology about American disengagement from the Middle East. I simply, if you look physically at where the U.S. is, certainly in the security realm, where the U.S. is present, whether it's in the Mediterranean or the Gulf, you don't see a decline. In fact, you see a slight increase measured that way. Where it's less clear, of course, is in terms of sort of a deliberate political strategy in terms of pressing problems in the region, a desire for an end state in Syria that's clear, other things like this, where I think allies are sort of rightly concerned that the United States is simply a bit adrift. And I think that's absolutely true. I would say that, in fact, there are many structural things that pull the United States back to this region. Part of it, of course, is having the Middle East peace process, having the prospect of a comprehensive settlement is basically the ultimate diplomatic prize for any administration. And I think that's a constant. You can see that even in the engagement of this administration, although I don't rate the prospects highly. But in other terms, I think there is a process of sort of relative decline of the Middle East as a strategic focus that started way beyond this, before this administration, in fact. I think you could see it during the Obama administration. And in some respects, it's a reaction to many years of extraordinary activism in the Bush years in the Middle East and intervention. And I think on the Hill, in terms of the strategic establishment in the United States, there has been a clear fatigue about this. And a set of kind of disillusionments with progress in the peace process, disillusionments about the sort of post-Arab revolution, evolution of societies, an increasingly energy-independent United States. I don't think this was ever a major driver, frankly, of American engagement in the region, but it was one, and it's declined in some important ways. Less attention to human rights. There are a whole series of things that I think have caused the United States to step back. If you look at it in terms of sub-regional settings, like North Africa, I mean, this is a Mediterranean conference. I think it's important to think about this in terms of North Africa and the Maghreb as well. I think there will be places where there's an inclination for the United States to simply say Europe should take the lead here, as we did in the Balkans, as I could see us doing in North Africa, and so on. But above all, I would say simply we have a rise of looming strategic concerns elsewhere. Above all in Asia, I would say, where there are extremely dangerous contingencies and very long-term geopolitical competitions. So it's not disengagement, but it's changed in some important ways, and it is a degree of drift. The second point I would make is the traditionally American policy in the region, and I'd say this is true for Europe as well, has been configured around a series of crisis management problems, dealing with flashpoints, managing conflicts when they come up. That may not be the situation we have now. We may have that, but we actually have a backdrop, frankly, from the Maghreb all the way to the Gulf and beyond, of something that's probably better described as durable chaos. Syria may never go back together the way it was. Libya may never go back together the way it was. These very chaotic conditions that we see in the Maghreb and in the Levant may simply be the norm for the next decade. That's not how we're used to making policy. And it accounts, I think, for a bit of this drift. It also puts particular pressure, I would say, on some key strategic relationships. Now, I would just single out Turkey. Turkey is a key partner for the United States, for Europe. This is an old relationship. It's never been easy. It's gotten much, much more difficult. American policymakers tend to look at Turkey, they point at the map and say it's relevant to all of these situations. It's a key strategic ally, but that takes you only so far. We're simply not on the same page when it comes to policy about the Kurds, about end states in Iraq, about Iran, about many other things. On Iran, will the administration get out of the nuclear deal? There's a decent chance that they will. I personally think that's extremely bad news. If you accept that we're dealing with an extended period of geopolitical competition and chaos, I would rather not see that conducted with a nuclear issue looming in the background. And I think much of the American strategic class would agree with that, but the administration may not go in that direction. Finally, just a last brief point, which is that I think even with the Middle East, there are elements of this administration's policy that are, strongly driven by domestic public policy concerns. And I would mention just two, one much more important than the other. One is counterterrorism. I mean, it's simply a lens through which so much is seen in this region above all. And secondly, clearly, I mean, if we see the president's visits and his interactions, this sort of economic nationalism and the desire to do commercially visible deals in the Gulf and elsewhere is also part of the equation. So I think you take all of that together. It's not an answer to where the administration's going, but I think it's maybe some of the contours.
Since you have a few minutes left, can you elaborate on some specific areas where you see continuity and discontinuity between
with the Obama administration
or previous?
Well, clearly, I think the Bush administration was something of an anomaly in that you had this for a number of reasons, a number of things came together. I mean, you could never really escape from that experience of 9/11, which drove a very sort of unusual view of the world and in particular of the Middle East, and this desire to shake things up, simply to break the order. The Obama administration was not about this. The Obama administration took a much more cautious, arm's-length view of the region, but in certain instances was much more focused on questions of human rights and other things. I think this administration sort of combines the reticence about intervention with a reticence about democracy promotion, and it does, in net terms, result in less attention to the region. And they're very focused on other things, on China, on Korea, and so on. The distraction effect, I think, is very important.
We now have Robert Malley, who's Vice President for Policy for the International Crisis Group.
Thanks, and thanks for all of you for showing up. In the brief time I've been in Rome, about less than 48 hours, I think, just looking at our newspapers every morning, which I know is an adventure now, three things have happened. We see reports that Secretary Tillerson may be on his way out. And if the rumors are correct and the names of the people who would succeed him are accurate, that would represent quite a big change in some aspects of our Middle East policy. Reports that President Trump may announce as early as Wednesday that the United States formally recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And reports that the former National Security Advisor may have been lobbying foreign countries on a vote of the Security Council during the transition period, which may be a violation of U.S. law. So given all this dizzying number of events, for me to try to explain, let alone predict U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East under Trump would be something of a miracle. But let me try, rather than get into specifics, to try to offer a guide, how I try to think about U.S. policy under this administration by looking at three baskets, and you mentioned two of them already. The basket of continuity, the basket of discontinuity, and the basket of dysfunctionality. When it comes to the basket of continuity, and I think there is more continuity than some might have expected, there's several reasons for that. Number one, this is not an administration that comes in with an overarching ideology about how to deal with the Middle East. It doesn't have a strong ideologue about how to deal with the Middle East. There's nobody like Dick Cheney who has a clear view and who's trying to implement it. You have a number of people with some ideas, you have instincts, but you don't really have an overarching ideology that is driving policy, and that does mean that you're not going to have the kind of discontinuity that you would have had if, for example, the neoconservatives had been back in the saddle. So that's one reason why there's not this much of a break. The other reason there's not much of a break on some issues is because of the vacuum at senior levels of the administration. A number of assistant secretaries are not in a position, a number of ambassadors are not in position, a number of other senior positions are still unfilled, which means that what some derisively call the deep state, the people who have been working from one administration to the other on issues that don't make the headlines, they're still making policy, they're still implementing policy, and therefore there is a degree of continuity on those issues which we could discuss in a minute. And then there's continuity on some of the big themes, and Ian mentioned some: counterterrorism, the fight against ISIL, support for Iraq, all of those, and some of our traditional alliances, those go back generations or at least the last two administrations, and those are continuing. Those are a level of sustainable policy, I think, that we've seen that has not changed in any dramatic way. And as Ian said, our footprint in the region, this myth about U.S. disengagement to a large extent, at least in terms of the if anything, disproportionate attention that U.S. policy gives to the Middle East, that has remained a constant. And if anything, as people know, the number of U.S. servicemen and women in the region has increased quite significantly in the last several months. So that's for the level of continuity. Discontinuity, I think one needs to think of in terms of those issues, in particular, on which President Trump campaigned on which he feels like he has a personal interest, and his constituency, what he considers his base, has a real interest, in which he could make a sharp departure from President Obama's signature achievements. That's where you see and where he relates it to his theme of economic nationalism, of America Firstism. On those areas where President Trump has a keen interest and when he really wants to show that he's breaking from his predecessor, there you see real rupture and discontinuity. And the obvious example is the Iran deal. I'll come back to that in a second. But that's where, on issues like paying less attention to human rights, democracy, trying to be closer to some of the leaders of the region that President Obama had difficulties with, and again, trying to shore up, trying to break from the big issues. And some of these have nothing to do with the Middle East, but in the Middle East, the biggest one would be the Iran deal. That's one measure of discontinuity. The other measure of discontinuity has less to do with the president himself than with the team that he brought on, which feels very strongly, and I think really this is not personal to President Trump, and I may disagree with it, but I think we have to understand it, which is that senior members of his administration believe that the Obama administration was too leery to use force, that it eroded the sense of U.S. deterrence and U.S. credibility in the region, and it undermined some of our key alliances with Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc. And you have a cohort, a strong constituency of people, from the National Security Advisor to the Secretary of Defense and others, who strongly believe that, and therefore believe that the U.S. has to restore that sense of power and deterrence and credibility in the region, and that's another break, at least in some of the policies that are being implemented. And where this all comes together, these two themes of the president wanting to make his mark on issues where he feels that he needs to distinguish himself from his predecessor, and in particular on the core agenda of President Obama, and this desire to bring back this notion of deterrence, is obviously Iran, because it all comes together. The JCPOA was a deal that President Obama signed. It was a deal against which President Trump personally campaigned, and it is representative, emblematic of what many people, Iran is emblematic of what many people on his team believe has been an overly weak U.S. policy towards the region, and a policy that broke with some of our traditional allies, which is why Iran becomes a focus, perhaps even bordering on an obsession for this administration. Again, we could come back to it, but a lot of the region, I think, is viewed by this administration through the lens of Iran. Dysfunctionality, third, I don't need to say too much about that, but this is an administration where, to begin with, you have a big disconnect between the president and what he campaigned on and the team that he brought on. Here's a president who campaigned against the traditional Republican establishment, against the Iraq War, against involvement in the Middle East in particular, but he brought in people who stand for the opposite to a large extent. And that creates what I have called the trilemma of this administration. It's trying to do three things at the same time that it just can't do. Increase the pace of the war against terrorism, whatever that is, increase the pressure on Iran, including through real pressure on the ground, and reduce America's footprint in the region. You could do two of those three, you can't do all three, and I think that's part of the tension that we're seeing running through the administration. Dysfunctionality, because the team is one in which, as I said, the flip side of not having people at senior levels, which, as I said, provides a measure of continuity, is that it also provides a measure of dysfunctionality, because there's some issues that are not being taken care of, because there are divisions that don't get settled, and because that leaves room for, I can't call them freelancers, but people who in the administration are doing things without an apparatus behind them, and what Jared Kushner is doing when it comes to the Middle East peace process is one example of that, clearly. And then finally, dysfunctionality when it comes to what I would call the presidency by tweets, where sometimes you see decisions that seem to be made or positions that seems to be taken, which then have to be corrected when it comes to the position that President Trump took on Qatar, the position that President Trump took on the crisis in Lebanon. In both cases, the immediate reaction was to side with Saudi Arabia, to side with the UAE. And then, after a while, you see an attempt to correct things by the State Department and by others, but that leaves a sense of unpredictability, of uncertainty, of unreliability. And I'll conclude on that. I think the message to people in this room is, because that's unlikely to change. It's unlikely that we're going to see a grand shift in this administration of more functionality and more coherence. I think what it means for people in this room, for people representing countries in this room, to have to take matters more in their own hands, to try to devise a policy that's more independent of the fluctuations of US policy, which is not always easy, but may not be for the worst.
Okay. So in the second round, I'd like to tease out further the continuity, discontinuity in both the diplomatic front and the military front in terms of the administration. But before we do that, turn to Walter Russell Mead, head of the national interest.
Hi, well, thank you for this, and as always, it's a pleasure to come to Rome, to Italy, and to be part of a well-organized conference. And I think I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that a lot of the interventions we've heard over the last couple of days are really, in some ways, much more interesting than what one often hears in these. What I would like to do this morning is to maybe step back just a little bit from the day-to-day and try to get sort of develop a way of thinking in a bit more orderly way about this very chaotic scene, both on American policy and on the situation on the ground in the region. I think it may be useful to think here about the distinction between sort of macro policy and micro policy. That micro policy is the tactics. How do we take the hill? How do we manage this small problem? Policy is the overall approach of a given administration. Macro policy, in a sense, is the longer range impact of American society, American preferences, and American decisions on a situation. And here, I think, in looking at the chaos in the Middle East, we tend to interpret this as, in a sense, a sign of a failure or waning of hegemony. That is, if the hegemon were really doing its job, everything would be quiet, because that's what hegemons do. But the U.S. is a different kind of power, not because of American exceptionalism or anything, I think, here, but simply because American power is indissolubly intermixed with capitalism, which is of itself a revolutionary force. And a world in which the United States is a leading power is going to be a world in change and constant overturn. And what we're seeing in the Middle East, it looks to me, is on the first level a grand success of American macro policy, which is to say that after the oil shocks of the 1970s and the eruption of the Middle East into perhaps the primary geopolitical theater in the world, a lot of people in the United States thought about, how do we change that? How do we diversify production? How do we basically, among other things, tap this large amount of hydrocarbon reserves in the United States and North America that in the technology of the 1970s was unavailable? And so we saw many decades of both government and private investment into unconventional techniques. Today, we are seeing the fruits of this success, and only the first fruits. That I think the latest long-term estimates from the International Energy Association suggest that U.S. production by 2030 will be about the equivalent of 30 million barrels a day, which is roughly 3 times the current production of Saudi Arabia or Russia. This is extraordinary, and the consequences in the region are extraordinary. We're seeing almost in some ways a reversal of what happened in the 1970s, where in a very short period of time, immense amounts of money moved into the region and reconfigured domestic politics, international relations, and the economic trajectory of the region, shifted the power balance. I mean, why is Saudi Arabia a more prominent voice than Egypt today as opposed to 1970? The reasons are not hard to see. So as a result of this sort of macro policy success, we see sort of a massive readjustment in the region and around the region. But if we simply look at the chaos and dysfunction in the region and say, well, this is a fantastic macro policy, isn't it? It produces random destruction and so on. One should also note that the lower price in oil of, sort of $100, $150 a barrel to the $50, $60 a barrel range, where would the European economy and the European Union be today if in the last 3 years we'd been looking at, given what's going on, an oil price maybe of $150 a barrel? How would that change the balance of forces between Russia and the EU? What would happen to Italy, Spain, Greece? What would those economies look like? So, and I can say the same about India, China, Japan, and many other parts of the world. So that while there is a regional destabilization, one should also be aware that there's a kind of countervailing global stabilizing impact, and both of these may well be continuing. And if we look, at the size of the transfer of resources, it is amazing. For individual countries, it's in the trillions of dollars over the next 10, 15 years. This is going to affect investment horizons, priorities. I should also just point out, and then I see my time will be up, that in the United States, we're likely also to see a stabilizing political impact from this shift, that the rise in energy production in the U.S. will be creating a lot of blue-collar jobs, a lot of opportunities for exactly the people whose discontent, I think, helped to fuel the Trump phenomenon, both directly in, imagine 30 million barrels a day, that's a lot of jobs, but also in a lower energy price in the United States, basically having a lot to do with the mechanics of natural gas, so that the United States is going to be a much more attractive location, perhaps also with these corporate income taxes that we're hearing, or reductions we're hearing about, for manufacturing operations, large-scale manufacturing operations. Again, a kind of at least an Indian summer, an afterglow for the American middle class and the working class. So we may see actually a calming impact in American politics, just as we're seeing a calming impact in European and other politics from this shift. Perhaps in a second round I can get more into the policy and the micro-policy areas, but I felt it was important that we just take a little bit of a step back and try to frame what's going on. Thank you.
Well, to follow on, could you then speculate about the reduction in U.S. dependence on oil from the region to new actors, China being one of them, whose needs in terms of oil will increase, and how that impacts your analysis?
Yeah, I think it's been clear since the 1970s to sort of the mythical average American that there's some sort of connection between what's going on in the Middle East and what's happening at your local gasoline station. Price or availability depend on that. So it's been very easy for American presidents to say, this is something we have to think about, and for politicians, congressmen, senators to make the same case. Now the dependency in some ways is as real in the sense that if there were an interruption in Middle East exports of oil, while there wouldn't be a direct problem of supply in the United States, there would be a bit of a price shock, but more profoundly, if the economies of Europe, China, Japan, India were to go into some kind of tailspin because of an oil shock, what you would see would be a massive economic disruption in the United States. that dependency, while real, is harder to explain to people. So that would make me suspect that the threshold, say, for kinetic action in the Middle East, and certainly long-term kinetic action, might go higher. Now, terrorism, to some degree, may replace that direct oil dependency, but again, that's an issue that seems to wax and wane and grow or shrink in salience over time. But again, the U.S. macro policy is not simply to become a greater supplier itself, but to increase the diversity of energy supplies so that no single producer, no single region has the same central role in the same ability to disrupt the global economy that, say, the Persian Gulf countries had after the 1970s. So this is not only that this fracking technology is actually quite workable in many other parts of the world, but you can see that renewables and other shifts, you're leading to a world energy picture that is, I think, going to be more resilient, less susceptible to specific national or regional shocks, though not impervious to them.
So I attribute in some part the interest in this session, not only in terms of Trump, but the intrigue around the potential departure of Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State, and the suggested replacement being the Pompeo, who is at CIA, moving to state, and Cotton replacing Pompeo at CIA. Some have suggested that this is a closer alignment in terms of the potential worldview that Trump has. And so I'd like you to speculate on what does this mean in terms of emphasis, de-emphasis, in terms of military versus diplomacy, and how that has already manifested itself within the Trump administration, and then in terms of the macro issues, in terms of the perceptions of the region as a national interest, and how that may play out in terms of the policy implication. Ian?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, in terms of the personalities and who is taking what job, I mean, this is very speculative. I mean, I think it's probably a reasonable bet that we will see some change. But if it, just to take a hypothesis, the one that you laid out, I mean, clearly, if someone were to come in with a much more vigorous kind of activist, even ideological kind of approach, you know, very, as you say, very hawkish, very hard power-oriented, very national interest-driven, you know, sort of thing that President Trump has talked about applied into the policy realm, that's going to make a difference. That's going to make a difference. You know, I would go back, though, to the point that Rob made earlier, which is that, you know, in many of these areas of keen interest to Europe, in particular in North Africa and elsewhere, these are slightly esoteric issues in the American policy debate, and they rely on having sort of dynamic policymakers at a kind of high to mid level inside the administration, and a lot of these people simply aren't in place, or they don't know what direction they're going to sort of get from the top. And so a lot of it will depend not only on who a next Secretary of State might be, but also whether those positions are filled and what views they have. I would say, you know, if you look across all of this, one of the points that comes out very clearly is that Middle East policy, in a sense, has become less isolated from other factors, whether it's the energy factor, or it's the domestic security factor, or it's competitions in Asia. You know, many things are bearing on, you know, what the United States would want to do and can do in the Middle East, which were not typical of a kind of classical past, you know, where there was this Middle East policy and there were Middle East specialists. I think this is now all really changed. And of course, this didn't start with the Trump administration. It goes back probably, I would say, you know, since the end of the Cold War. Maybe we had 20 years in which it was a thing of its own right. If you go back to the Cold War period, much of our Middle East engagement was driven by a competition with the Soviet Union and so on. It's seen through that lens. We had 20 years or so in which that wasn't the case. And we're coming maybe back to a more traditional sort of situation in which these big geopolitical competitions are bearing on the region again.
Robert.
So, I mean, just to pick up on what that change may mean, and I don't really, as I said from the outset, I think to try to predict what this administration will do, what the president will do, is a bit of a fool's errand. So, yes, today it looks one way, but it may look very differently when we wake up tomorrow. I would come back. The one issue on which Mr. Pompeo and Tom Cotton have they've made their mark, at least rhetorically, has been on the issue of Iran. And, you know, as I said, there's vast continuity between all administrations. You know, people don't change policy overnight. But the issue on which this administration has rhetorically and in some ways already operationally tried to change its Middle East policy has been on Iran. And as I said, it really does bring everything together. It does bring together President Trump's animus towards the Iran deal, which doesn't seem to be based on fact, but on the reality that this was a deal that was entered into by his predecessor and that he decided was a bad deal. And because there is no pushback from others in the administration to this day. I mean, you have people for whom Iran is an issue of unfinished business. They experienced Iran during the occupation of Iraq as a country that was backing Shia militia that were killing Americans, and I think that business has not been completed yet. They need to do something about it. Also, there's no pushback from allies in the region, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Israel, they both are saying Obama was too soft, you have to be tougher. Now, we haven't seen, that hasn't yet materialized other than in the non-certification of the Iran deal and basically no diplomacy with Iran. We haven't yet seen a fundamental rupture. If you had, and partly I suspect it's because Secretary Tillerson and some others have a slightly more measured view of what that would mean. If you do have someone like Pompeo and like Cotton who have spoken very openly about regime change and about how Iran is the biggest threat, not just in the region but worldwide, I think you could see then the reimposition of sanctions against Iran, which would mean at least the American withdrawal from the deal, and you could see more kinetic forms of action or some other forms of action to try to go after Iran. As I said in my talk a couple of days ago, not only do I think it's the wrong thing to do in terms of the stability of the region, I think it's the wrong thing to do if the goal is to put Iran in a different place in the region. I think the kind of chaos that would unleash, if anything, would give Iran different opportunities to exercise its form of asymmetric power in the region. But I do think that's where I would be focused on if we see this change. It's to see whether the President Trump, who on some issues is sort of in the middle of the road. He likes to do everything in its opposite. He did that with healthcare. He's doing that with Iran. He doesn't certify, but he waives the sanctions. I think that would be the moment where we'd see whether there'd be an alignment between rhetoric and reality, and you'd see a policy towards Iran which would be far more confrontational, far more dangerous, and I would say far worse for both the region and Europe.
Since you brought this up in terms of and followed by Robert's comments, that you're not optimistic about the U.S. or Trump administration adhering to the Iran deal. Is it not possible that you could maintain adherence to the agreement but put greater pressure on Iran as one strategy? And my sense is that from others, including Ash Carter, that's a more likely strategy. And that just not connecting those, those are problematic, and dealing with them separately.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. I would agree with that, Jim. I think in the most likely case, maybe I'm just sort of imposing my preferences on it. I think that's where you go, because as I say again, I think the notion, if you accept that there is a growing geopolitical competition in the region, with a very hard-edged one, with the use of proxies and all sorts of things, and that's not likely to go away anytime soon. I would rather try to manage that situation without having this sort of cloud of unfettered nuclear proliferation on the top of it. I think that's a perfectly reasonable strategic proposition. It's not necessarily a very catchy ideological proposition. And so I think much will depend on the kinds of personnel issues that you were raising. There's a big gap between what's sort of politically attractive and compelling and what's strategically useful to do. I hope the administration goes with the latter, but we'll see.
And you and Robert or Walter might comment. It seemed, the other perspective of these are regional problems, shifting national interest, and that they should be dealt with regionally and in the context of Iran. In the discussion and presentation by the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, there seemed to be this pressure in terms of from within the region in dealing with the problems. Do you agree, or?
Well, I find there's been a very curious reversal of just the last few months. Had you asked this question a year ago or more, I would have said that the sort of attitudes in Congress and elsewhere were actually likely to put additional pressure on actors like Saudi Arabia. I mean, there was building criticism on Saudi Arabia, on Pakistan, on a lot of fronts. And, this sort of reversal and this sudden support for a much more assertive policy from Saudi Arabia is actually a very surprising thing. It may be driven by personal relationships, by the president's recent trips. I don't know, it's a matter of speculation. But it strikes me as a slightly eccentric choice.
Walter, I have a question for you in terms of, and I don't want to send you on a fool's errand, but what is your sense of the emerging national interest and as it may impact the next election cycle in terms of response to Trump's policies, changing national interest, and what the next election cycle might hold?
Well, you know how to ask questions. That's a big one. Look, I think in the first place, what the American public probably wants in areas that we've associated with Middle East policy is no terrorist attacks at home and plenty of cheap gas. And if those things can be achieved without a lot of war and U.S. casualties, I would say that the public would be happy. My guess is that unless something very dramatic happens, like a war, the next, both in 2018 and in 2020, domestic politics and policies will drive the election. That President Trump is such a polarizing figure and such a dominant media presence, it's going to be hard to see the next two elections as anything but referendums on him, even perhaps if he decides not to run in 2020 for some reason. But I think, again, it's, the economy is as hard to predict as politics. But if what we're seeing, and the forecasts continue to be broadly positive, we see that this current economic expansion continues through 2020, we're now at the stage where the benefits, to use a very controversial term of economic expansion, are trickling down, that we're seeing in the U.S. significant increases in the take-home pay of lower paid workers, unemployment levels dropping to levels that in the past have been very inflationary, but so far at least without the inflation. So if this is the case and you have a kind of a country where people feel that things are going well, because of Trump's personality, that may not redound to the benefit of incumbents as much as it often does. It's nevertheless going to be a strong underlying force in American economy. My own sense of what he would like to do is that President Trump is much more interested in barking than in biting when it comes to use of force abroad. That, he is a performer in some ways, and what people like in foreign policy, if you look at American history, they like America to win, they like for things to look good, but they really don't like war. And I think of someone like President Reagan, who sent the Marines into Beirut. There was this very shocking act of terror. The Marines were killed, hundreds of Marines killed. President Reagan, on the one hand, doesn't want to look like a loser and see American prestige decline. On the other hand, he doesn't want to send thousands more Marines back into Beirut. That's not what he does. What we see is a few weeks later, or months, I guess, there's an invasion of Grenada. And, you know, in that sense, it was a very effective theatrical and political use of power. And my guess would be that President Trump's instincts, he is more interested in Grenada's than in Beirut's. And so one can expect a foreign policy that will try at least to be opportunistic and theatrical, look for opportunities to move quickly and achieve dramatic change, both in terms of domestic opinion and international opinion, that sort of changes the frame, the tone in which people see things. That is what I think he would try to do. Whether he will succeed or whether emotions will get ahead of calculation, that's imponderable. But I don't think President Trump is a man who wants to send hundreds of thousands of American ground troops into overseas wars.
All right, so there is a fundamental shift in terms of international agreements which have been discussed extensively in this forum. And there appears to be tangible evidence that there is a de-emphasis in terms of diplomacy, international engagement, and reflected in not filling diplomatic posts, freezes, cuts in terms of U.S. aid and the State Department. What does that suggest in terms of the implications in terms of U.S. foreign policy within the region and in terms of in broader terms?
Well,
Ian, we'll start once.
This has been so hotly debated, and virtually every day there's an op-ed piece in the New York Times, the Financial Times, or something like this, talking about the effect of this hollowing out of the American sort of diplomatic establishment. You have to have people to manage these things. You have to have people in place. I'm in Brussels. There's still not a U.S. ambassador to the European Union, nor even a name in circulation. This is extraordinary. And so you need to have the people. You need to have policy made in some detail. I think that makes a difference. It also, of course, reinforces the tendency to view these things in a kind of very closely held national interests sort of way. And we have a tradition of this anyway. I mean, Walter will have a better sense, but I mean, certainly in Congress, the sovereignty consciousness, the disinclination to get into complicated, multilateral, UN mandated approaches to things when there is maybe something more minimalist that you can do on a national basis. I mean, that point you were making earlier about sort of character of intervention, there's an interesting case we already had with this, of course, in Syria, where when Trump decided to have these, very brief but quite extensive airstrikes in Syria, I mean, it struck me this was exactly what Hillary Clinton would have done under the circumstances, probably. And probably, maybe even what President Obama would have done had he been given a chance to, to come back at the issue again. So there are elements of continuity here, but I think in general it gets harder to manage that very traditional multilateral kind of approach when you don't have the people in place and you're not listening to those kinds of voices.
Yep. Robert?
I mean, I really don't have much to add to that. I think that's correct. I think, I mean, what's interesting is that there has been, I forget which one of the speakers said it earlier, there's sort of a secular trend, not so much of the U.S. disengagement. I think that's the wrong label. I think what is true, though, is that I think Ian said it's 20 years of sort of this special period of the U.S. I would even make it shorter. I think it's really from the end of the Cold War to the Iraq invasion. That's a period where the U.S. is basically sole superpower, and it tries to do things the way it did. And some could say that it was a period where more should have been done. But that's a really exceptional period of our history. Since then, I think it's more normal to have other powers that are going to challenge, that are going to rival, and the U.S. just can't make its decisions translate immediately into action, which means that you have to be. There is more of a premium on diplomacy, more of a premium on working with others, and that's what becomes more sacrificed at a time when there's this depletion at the State Department. I mean, if Rex Tillerson ends up being replaced in the coming weeks or months, the irony of his legacy is that I think in terms of his instincts, most of the sort of foreign policy establishment would say he had it right, and yet he seems to have single-handedly weakened the institution through which he could have had that right policy be promoted. It's one of the paradoxes, and for me a puzzle of his tenure. Why would he have weakened the institution that he needed to make his views, which were more, I'd say, sort of more in line with the traditional U.S. foreign policy, prevail? And there must be an explanation somewhere. Maybe it has to do with his history at Exxon. Maybe it has to do with his own background. But it's one of those paradoxes I think he's going to have to stay up late at night if he does get replaced and ponder about.
Well, in the remaining time, and maybe quickly, all three of you might comment on, can the U.S. afford not to be engaged within the region and globally?
Just quickly to fill in on this point, these points, I think it's important to understand that we not only see a crisis of the State Department in the U.S., which has been building for several administrations, but we're also seeing, I think, a crisis of the institutional multilateral modes of diplomacy in which the State Department excels, that the institutions and structures created after World War II and strengthened after the Cold War were built for times in which international politics was much more stable. So something happens in a country like Turkey, changes orientation perhaps in very fundamental ways. Structures like NATO are not well equipped to deal with this sort of thing. And we're going to see, I think, perhaps a tendency toward more rapid movement, not just of the United States, but of all countries. In some ways, the world is becoming less German and more Italian, less bureaucratic, institutional, and more sort of individual flair and sort of short-term transactional. So this is, and this creates problems for bureaucracies and institutions that historically specialize in those.
Quickly.
I mean, I very much agree with that, and in fact, I think you heard echoes of this or a foretaste of this in the discussion yesterday about security cooperation in the Mediterranean, because if you take the NATO case, for example, I mean, NATO struggles with the problem of treating these issues, sort of basically Middle Eastern issues in the Middle East and North Africa, bear on European security, where they would like to have the U.S. involved as well. But it's an institution that is historically configured largely to deal with problems emanating from Russia. The Soviet Union, Russia. And that's still a tension in the alliance. I do think under a sort of steady state where you don't have big other alternative pressures in Asia the U.S. has to face, that the U.S. would naturally be drawn more into a, with Europe, a treatment of these issues in North Africa, in the Middle East, in the Levant. It's migration, it's counterterrorism, it's many things that are bearing on European security. I mean, that's another facet of the U.S. engagement. So to go back to your question, Jim, about whether we can afford not to be engaged, I think the short answer is no, we can't, but there may be things that happen elsewhere in the world that simply are too big to ignore, and we leave this in a burden-sharing mode to others.
Robert, the last word.
10 seconds or less. I think President Obama sort of recognized that there was a number of things on which the U.S. cannot do it alone, and so it had to do with others. I think President Trump realizes that there may be a number of things that the U.S. can't do it alone, and so we won't do them at all.
Well, I want to thank the panel for very thoughtful and insightful comments about the Trump administration policy toward the Middle East and the next election. Thank you very much.